John Adams was the second president of the United States, the successor to George Washington. John Adams' presidency had its ups and its downs. Its downs were at least as important as its ups, which is why he only had one term. He served for 4 years and then lost an attempt for re-election to Thomas Jefferson. The worst thing that John Adams did, and this is one of the reasons that he lost the election to Jefferson in 1800, the worst thing that John Adams did was to sign the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts were a group of 4 measures that were passed by the Federalist-controlled Congress in 1798. John Adams was a Federalist, and he supported the Federalist program. The United States in the 1790s faced a series of challenges amid a European war pitting primarily France and Britain. And the Federalist Party was established in the United States in the first decade after the establishment under the new Constitution, and it favored the British in this contest between Britain and France. The opposition party, Thomas Jefferson's Republican Party, favored the French. When the Federalists were in office, American policy tended to be pro-British and anti-French. When the Republicans, Jefferson's party, were in power, American policy tended to be pro-France and anti-Britain. So Adams is in office, and the country is in a diplomatic dispute with France, a diplomatic and sort of military naval dispute, because in the war between Britain and France, both the British and the French are seizing American merchant vessels and trying to prevent their goods from getting to the other side in that Franco-British war. And so when the Federalists were in power, when Adams was in power, the U.S. government tended to blame the French more than the British, although both sides were committing these violations of American neutral rights. The upshot of it was that when Adams was president, the United States, under John Adams, waged what was called the quasi-war against France. It was a series of naval engagements against France on the Atlantic and in the Caribbean. As part of this, out of concern that this naval war might become a full-fledged war between the United States and France, the Federalists in Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Acts basically made it harder for foreigners to get citizenship in the United States. It so happened that many foreigners joined the Republican Party. And so by keeping them from becoming citizens, it would basically suppress the Republican vote. This is something that the Federalists thought was something they ought to do. It also made it more difficult for foreigners to get a foothold here in politics. It made it easier for the government to deport foreigners. Foreigners basically, that is, immigrants who hadn't been naturalized citizens yet. It made it possible for the government to deport anybody that they didn't like, who wasn't already a citizen. So it was basically an anti-foreign and anti-Republican measure, the Alien Acts. The one that really got everybody upset, though, was the Sedition Act. Sedition is the practice or the act of undermining a government. And the Sedition Act made it a crime to criticize the government of the United States in many circumstances. Now, this was a clear violation of the First Amendment of the Constitution. The First Amendment had never seriously been tested, and here it was. Congress had passed this law, clearly abridging freedom of speech and freedom of the press. John Adams signed the Sedition Act into law and then oversaw the prosecution of Republican critics of the administration. This was really a low point in America's respect for freedom of speech, freedom of the press, basically for the freedoms that were supposed to be enshrined in the First Amendment. This was the low point of the Adams presidency, Adams administration. What was the best thing that John Adams did? Well, the best thing that John Adams did was not to lose to Thomas Jefferson, but that's what set up the best thing he ever did. John Adams lost to Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1800, and then he left office quietly. He did not claim that the votes had been rigged. He didn't claim fraud. He didn't claim that he really still should be president. He did not contest his defeat. And this was crucial. In any, well, the United States isn't a democracy yet at this point, but in any democracy, in any republic, in any system of self-government where people vote, the most important election is not the first election. Okay, lots of countries have first elections. Nor is it necessarily the second election, although that's important. Sometimes countries have first elections but never get around to a second election. The first people say, forget the election, we're just going to stay forever. No, the really important election is the first election where the incumbent party loses. Because then the question is, what do you do? Do you say fraud was committed and you don't leave office? Well, John Adams made clear that that would not be the case in the United States. He lost fairly, he left quietly, and in doing so, he made very clear that the United States would be a country where the political system was governed by rules, by the vote, by respect for what the system came up with, by way of choosing its leaders. It was his finest moment.